thank you so much for coming. I've been really excited about this class. I haven't taught this before, although I am very much a gardener and very much an astrologer. So it was a natural combination, and I was really honored to be asked to teach this. So here is a quote that I feel like is really a good entry point. By their gardens ye shall know them. You know, not everybody gardens, but in my opinion, everybody should. And gardening can be as simple as just a little pot on the windowsill, or it can be a big elaborate garden. It really doesn't matter. Gardening is something that is very close to my heart, and there's a lot of different reasons to garden. Why do we garden? Well, one, it literally keeps us alive, whether it's food or clothing or medicine or shelter. We're kind of helpless without plants. I am a multiple earth sign. I've got 4 planets in Virgo and a north node in Capricorn. So I am very directed towards the growing of things, but there's so many different reasons to do this. You know, ethnobotany is something that is the study of the intersection of plants and people. So here's plants, here's people. How do people use plants in all the different ways? And then astrobotany is the intersection of plants and planets. That's something that I have been studying for a while, and the column that I write for the Mountain Astrologer is a deep dive into that, and the art classes that we were talking about. And then astroethnobotany, which is a word that I don't think I coined, but I haven't read it yet. That would be where we find ourselves today with lunar gardening. Here's a little ethnobotanist, a little bee person interacting with an opium poppy. Most of the pictures in this presentation are from my gardens over the years. So why would we garden by the moon? So when you really think about it and just slow down from the busy world that we're all in and tune into the cycles and the seasons, we're not separate from nature by any stretch of the imagination. And people have been gardening by the moon phases for a really long time. As long as we've been growing plants, we've also been observing the sky story, the ever-changing sky story. And it's really just kind of the blink of an eye that we've been in this industrial revolution era with all of the things that mitigate our attention towards the sky story. But astrology was developed over, 1,000 years plus by just observing, like, whoa, what's going on today? Oh, that's there. Oh, so it really is pattern observation. And if we're going to distill it down to observing the phases of the moon, which is the essence of gardening by the moon, there's some really obvious relationships that people have been observing and utilizing, because now we're separate from, like, we can just go to the store and get our food. We don't have to be farmers or gardeners, but that also is pretty recent. For a long time, growing food was how we had food. So, there's the folk method and the scientific method. I mean, I've studied herbalism for a long time, and I always appreciate the scientific information, obviously, but I've always been very moved by the folk method, the folk tradition, and the folk observations. So here we have the folk and the scientific communities coming together. Gardening by the moon makes sense. If what we're trying to do is be effective and, have more crops that are stronger and are more pest resistant and produce more food over time, then we're going to want to do anything really that helps us with that. So the basic principle is that we know the moon has a significant influence over the earth. We know that it controls the tides, and every single thing has a tide. Here's the oceans, we see that, that's very obvious, but any place where there's water, that same tidal effect is going to be pulling on the water. So that includes the soil, which is like maybe a little tiny ocean within, the moisture content in the soil. So if we're paying attention to the both moon phases and the signs, and we're doing our best to combine the most ideal combination, then you're going to get an extra fortified garden. So, like I was saying, plants will sprout more quickly, they'll grow in a more vigorous and healthy way, and they're less susceptible to any sort of pest damage. So, just planting a seed is one thing, but it is a whole enveloping experience, and we have to pay attention to all of that. And that's what's really cool about this method, is that the different phases and the different signs are going to be strong for different things, all the different things that we need to do in a whole global, experience of gardening. So how does it work? So if we're looking at the moon phases, there is either increasing light or decreasing light, and this is going to control the moisture content in the soil. So that is because the Earth's gravitational field is pulled by both the sun and the moon. So we're always going to have the highest tides at the new and the full moons. And we know that this is when the sun and the moon are lined up with the Earth in a way that they're making the pull happen. So seeds are going to absorb the most water at the full moon. So you're going to want to start seeds just before this time to catch the rising moisture tide. So I'll say this, you know, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be reiterated in different ways, because this is pattern observation and a pattern language that we're learning. I mean, you're already all astrologers enough to be attending this course, so you are pattern language people. And so we're going to be now applying this to this different field. And so, you know, planting on the new or the full moon, that's not exactly the times to do it, because that's when the tide is turning. So you want to do, like, as the rising tide happens of the moisture, that's when you're going to plant, just pre-new, just pre-full. There's a lovely clary sage, one of my favorites. So here's a little look at the moon phases. So the increasing moon is from new to full. So in this time, you're going to plant your above ground annuals. In the first quarter, that's going to be best for the plants that produce their seeds outside of the fruiting body, for example, lettuces or any sort of leafy greens. And then the second quarter, which is full and then beginning to decrease, that's best for plants that are going to produce their seeds inside the fruit. So peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers. And then the decreasing moon, you know, the dark moon, post-full, heading back to the new, that's going to be the time that is most supportive to root crops, bulbs, perennials, biennials. So, you know, think about this, like, woof, we've got increasing light and increasing moisture. Those above ground annuals, those are the ones that are going to be like, they're carried in that tide, that above ground tide. And then as things are decreasing, we see the natural intention to go down into the earth, into the invisible, you know, and this is a micro macro relationship to the solar cycle. You know, like if we're starting at winter solstice, that would be the new sun / new moon, if we're looking at the macro micro. And then when we get to the summer solstice, that would be the full sun. And then we would be decreasing the sun from summer solstice back to winter solstice. So in the same way that if you're a gardener, you know, you may have had the most riotous garden that's so incredible throughout the summer and into the fall, starting in the spring. And then winter comes and it disappears to the ground. I mean, every winter I'm out there like, do I still have a garden out there? It's so hard to believe. And yet, bink, 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 as soon as everything starts to increase again, everybody starts to appear above ground. So this is what we're doing every month with this cycle. Here's Buddha a couple of springs ago in my garden, looking very happy. He's clearly a Taurus. All right, so the moon changes signs every 2.5 days, and different signs are associated with different elements. So if we have any of the earth sign moons, then we're looking at root growth being favored. If we're looking at any of the air sign moons, we're looking at flowers being favored. And if we're looking at any of the fire sign moons, then we have fruits and seeds, and the water signs are the best for leaves. So almost all plants love the fertile water signs, and most root crops love the earth signs, and most flowers love the air signs, but especially Venus ruled Libra, which seems extra special, right? So, and then berries and fruit are the fire signs. And if you like think about like, what is a berry? What is a fruit? It's like that ensconced solar energy, that fire is inside of the fruit, that ripening and the sugar. So, you know, like just as I'm saying all of this, if this is brand new to you, just like let it kind of wash over you and just start to feel into it. Don't use your mind so much as use your body to respond to this, because this is a body art as much as anything else. And astrology is very heady. And I personally, in my work, I'm always trying to kind of bring it, like I use a lot of imagery because I always want to bring it into the other, like the right and the left part of the brains. So every month, I mean, between every sign, when the moon is traveling, say it was in Aries this morning, I think it's just about changed to Taurus, there's going to be a brief period of time, and it was very brief today, where the moon is done making an aspect to a different planet, and then nothing happens until it goes into the next sign. That is called a void of course moon. And sometimes it's really long. It just depends on where the other planets are. Today, because the moon was squaring Pluto, we just had like a degree, I think, where it was void of course. But whatever that amount of time is, you also want to, you're invited to track the void of course moons, because in the same way that we would use a void of course outside of gardening, it's a time to kind of chill out and just rest. You're not going to do anything, you know, very garden oriented at this time during the void of course moon. You know, it's like it's a little mini holiday, take a little rest, walk around your garden, maybe eat something that you have grown in your magical garden using this sort of support. So something else that I want to talk about is, you know, everything that I'm teaching you today, it is not going to supplant or transcend your basic garden knowledge, which includes the zone that you're in. So zones are there. There's the Sunset Guide has a certain form of zones, and then there's the USDA. I tend to use more the USDA, and the zone tells you about your frost dates. So, you know, here where I am in Northern California, our average last frost date is about April 15th. And, you know, it's not science. It's definitely like an estimation. Like we definitely sometimes would have a late frost, or it would start earlier. I mean, but that's when you're essentially going to be like, okay, it's more or less safe to start planting things out. Up until that point, you're going to be in greenhouses, you're going to have frost protection, you're going to have row covers, and that's a way to extend your season. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that it's beyond the scope of this class for me to be able to detail all of this stuff in your zone, in everybody's zones. So your job as a gardener is to know your zone, to know your frost dates, and then to apply this on top of that. So here's a USDA map of the zones. This is again just the United States, but this is available for the whole world. I'm over here in zone 9. I was kind of shocked to see that I have the same as all of this. It seemed like I was like, no, I'm more in zone 8, but nope, I'm in zone 9. Okay, so if you're doing lunar gardening, it works a lot better if you're using organic gardening techniques. And maybe you all already do this, but in case there's anybody that doesn't, I just want to talk about just kind of the basics of what is organic gardening. It's using inputs that are not chemical fertilizers. They are organic. And so the living biome is all of the things that are going on in the soil. You know, there's like, we know that in one little teaspoon of soil, there is an insane amount of things going on. And all of those things have to do with how successful and healthy your garden is, in addition to what we're talking about today. So regular composting, amending with good, healthy fertilizers, adding the micro and the macronutrients. We need those, plants need those. Mulching, I'm a huge proponent of mulching. That's a way to bring in the earthworms. If you mulch heavily on the top, then if the top of your soil is cold and wet, the earthworms feel like they can come all the way to the top and do their tilling, and they're like the angels of the garden. So cover cropping, planting certain seeds that are really good for, you know, like you can anchor nitrogen. You can bring nitrogen in by planting certain legumes and then tilling them in, meaning you turn them in, they become part of the soil. It's like kind of composting in place. And that enriches your soil very naturally. And then companion planting, which is a whole nother topic, and that is that certain plants like to grow with other certain plants. There's little natural plant communities. And if you can tap into that, and the lunar gardening and the organic gardening and your zones, you know, these are all the things, these are all your tools that you want to be working with to have the wind in your sail for the best possible gardens. Here's a really lovely garden in Germany that is very inspiring. I don't know much about it, but I see pictures of it periodically. So I was happy to find one to grab to put in here to also inspire you. I mean, look at that, the checkerboards, the spiral. These people are clearly gardening by the moon. There's a little quote, some old time wisdom. The old time gardeners say, with the waxing of the moon, the earth exhales. When the sap in the plants rise, the forest first goes into the growth above ground. Thus, you should do all activities with plants that bear fruit above ground during a waxing moon. With the waning of the moon, the earth inhales, then the sap primarily goes down towards the roots. Thus, the waning moon is a good time for pruning, multiplying, meaning propagating, fertilizing, watering, harvesting, and controlling parasites and weeds. That's from gardener Ute York. Here's a little bumblebee visiting a foxglove chamber. All right, I just want to just take a little bit of time about the astrology of 2022, where we find ourselves, reasons to garden. So backing up slightly to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 2020, something that we astrologers were kind of nervously eyeing for a while. From what I hear, some people since the 70s, but I haven't been at it for that long. So I was definitely nervously eyeing it for a few years. And knowing that whatever it was that was coming, it was going to be massive and it was going to change everything forever. So here we are 2 years after that point, and sure enough, it was massive and it has changed everything forever, and it's not really done yet. You know, Pluto is in the last degrees of Capricorn, and that is a very special demolition of all things Capricorn. So I think of it as burning the dross, you know, the giant cauldron of all of the things, everything gets put into it. You know, Capricorn being the most embodied, embedded structure of society, of culture, of government. And because this is a realm where shadow exists, we know that there's a great deal of corruption that has been baked into the cake. And so never fear, Pluto is here to make sure that we cook it down so that all the bad is gone and only the good is left. It's a long, slow, arduous process. And it also dovetails in with the United States Pluto return. That's the country that I live in. Obviously, there's a lot more countries in the world, but because the United States has been the world's superpower more or less since World War II, the end of World War II, what happens here really affects everybody. So a Pluto return is super intense. You guys probably have been tracking the US Pluto return at least lightly, because a lot of astrologers have been writing about it. But you know, we're in it, like we're in this process, and it's going to be another couple of years before it's completely done. And you know, we need to be able to take care of ourselves. We need to be able to grow our own food. We need to be able to have resources that are more than just what's in the store. I mean, world leaders are now openly speaking about the imminent food shortages. Joe Biden talked about it last week. Trudeau talked about it this week, I think. So I'm taking it very seriously, and I really want you guys to take it seriously too, because you know, worst case scenario, you have a giant burgeoning garden and you learn how to can and dry things and dehydrate and have a bunch of things to share. You know, like that's the worst case scenario. Like the best case scenario is that all of that makes total sense and you're really glad that you've learned these skills, because not everybody is going to be able to garden. So those of us that are gardeners, we need to, I mean, it's one of the most blissful things to do. I just adore gardening, but it is survival. So Uranus and Taurus, Uranus is the great awakener. It's the planet that's going to take us to the next level, but it can be really shocking and traumatic if there are things that we're not looking at. And Uranus and Taurus means that all of the Taurian themes, which is money and the economy and food source, homes, our bodies, all of these things are being Uranicized. So all this weird stuff with AI, all this disruption with the supply chain and food, you know, all of this is very Uranus and Taurus, and we're not done with this until 2026. And right now, this year, we just kicked off a year and a half of Taurus Scorpio nodes, the moon's nodes, traveling through this particular axis, which means the eclipses are going to be here, and the eclipses are going to include Uranus too. So Taurus and Scorpio is the life, death, life axis. And the South Node in Scorpio means there's a lot of purging that's going away, which I would put composting in that direction. And then that cycle of, you know, the gross yucky stuff gets composted and then it becomes fertility for the next cycle. North Node in Taurus tells us unequivocally we need to be tuned into the land. We need to be tuned into our bodies. We need to be tuned into growing food in the most simple, pure, and easy ways. Like the world's getting so complex and so weird and so bizarre that our salvation lies in the garden in many, many ways. Here's a little opium poppy that had some really wild stripes a few years back. All right, back to moon gardening. So the phases of the moon is the best place to start. So the rising and the falling tides in conjunction with the waxing and waning moon is pulling the tiny tides in the soil and in the seeds. So again, the new and the full moons are going to be where the moisture is pulled up the most, and that's going to inspire imbibition, which is a fancy word for the seed uptaking water that makes it swell, and it makes the seed casing crack, and those first leaves come out, the first cotyledon leaves, and the radical comes down and the growth begins. So that's what we're doing when we're starting seeds. It's like you can just unconsciously be like, oh, I have some time, I'm going to start some seeds. Or you can use this method and really think about it. Either way, you know, hopefully your seeds sprout. But if what we're trying to do is have maximum alignment, and you know, one of the ways that astrology has been used for a long time is this electional kind of thing where you're timing things. So we're using electional astrology for the birth of these tiny little baby seeds, and we want to give them the very best condition we possibly can for sprouting and then subsequent growth. So if you're planning by the moon's phases, you're keeping in rhythm with nature, with the gravitational pull on all water and moisture. And, you know, as a woman, you know that your moon cycle is tied with the moon, and, you know, your menstrual cycle. And, you know, with artificial lights, it's changed somewhat, but before there was so much artificial lighting, women would always bleed with the new or the full moon, and still women will pull each other into, you know, into concert with each other's cycles. So this is all the same stuff. We are not separate from nature in any way, shape, or form. So there's 4 phases or quarters of each moon cycle, you know, 1 month being about 27.5 days. So each of the quarter is going to last approximately 7 days. And the first 2 quarters are always going to be waxing light, and the second 2 quarters are always going to be waning light. So that's where we're starting. That's the most simple common denominator of this process. So then we know that the moon is following approximately the same path as the sun around the zodiac, but instead of it taking a year, it's taking 27.5 days. So again, reiterating, ascension for 14 days, descension for 14 days. In the ascending moon, the plant sap rises more strongly, and the upper parts of the plants are like filled with sap and vitality. And also fruit that's harvested now remains fresh longer in storage. Same thing, it's like uptaking all of this juicy vitality, and that is what you want to harvest. And then the descending moon, the plants are going to take root more easily, and they're going to connect well with their new location. So that is known as the transplanting or the repotting time. So any version of transplanting, any version of repotting, if you want to time it, use it in the descending moon and everything's going to go better. You know, I mean, I've definitely had the experience of transplanting things, not paying attention to this and just noting like, wow, that went really well. And then other times it's like, oh no, oh gosh, I thought it was okay and it's not, you know. So this is a way to make sure that, you know, like if you're tuned into the plant kingdom and you're a gardener and you love all the green people, you really, really love them and you really want them to do the best they can. So this is another way to use this technique. So planting seeds is called sowing, and that can be done at either time, ascending or descending moon, you know, depending on what you're doing. Get that far out of the way. Okay, so a couple of other lunar considerations. Twice a month, the moon crosses the nodes, and this is an unfavorable time for plant growth. So right now, again, the moon's nodes are in Taurus and Scorpio. So right now, the moon just went into Taurus. So the moon's coming in the early degrees of Taurus, and the nodes are at 28 or something like that. So we have all of today, part of tomorrow, and then at some point we're going to get the Taurus moon going across the north node. And then subsequently it will happen with the south node. So those are days to not do any garden things. And then eclipses, which are also connected to the moon's nodes, are also unfavorable times for plant growth. All right, I see that Carla raised her hand. I'm not used to doing this. I'm going to see what happens if I click on it. Carla, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? If not, I am going to have some, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, participants can't unmute themselves in a webinar format, but she could type her question in the Q&A.
Okay, great. Yeah, please.
Oh, it looks like that was a mistake.
Oh, it was an accident. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Carla. Okay, as we were. Let's see. Okay, so now let's take a little bit deeper look at the moon phases. So the new moon, this is when the lunar gravity is going to pull that water up, and it's going to cause the seeds to swell and burst. So that combined with the increased moonlight, this is why we have the balanced root and leaf growth. So the first quarter is the best time for planting above ground crops. So anything that's it's gonna be something that is an above ground harvest, you know, so it's greens or, yeah, what have you. It's not going to be like carrots and things like that that are underneath. So annual crops that produce their seeds outside the fruit again. So we have lettuce, spinach, celery, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, and grain crops. First quarter. So in the first quarter, the gravitational pull is less, it's stronger at the new and the full, but the moonlight is getting really strong. So those leafy greens are getting very healthy in response to this. So this is generally a good time for planting, especially again, those 2 days before the full moon. So the first quarter is leading up to the full moon. And then that's where the pivot happens and it begins to go the other direction. So, you know, and I know from studying astrological magic that that's also considered the best time to do moon spells. If you wait until the actual full moon, some people that I really respect a lot say that the cup is too full. It's so full of the lunar energy that it's just going to spill out. So if you want to do anything with that full moon, do it a couple of days before. So the same for planting. So this is the best time to plant annuals that are going to produce above ground, but versus the first quarter, the new moon, their seeds form inside the fruit. So beans, melons, peas, peppers, squash, and tomatoes. And this feels connected to the extra moonlight. Okay, so yeah, planting just before the full moon to get the benefits of the peak moisture. So the full moon, and that opens the third and fourth quarters. And that is when the light, it peaks and then it begins to wane or decrease. And then the energy is drawing down. The highest amount of moisture is in the soil at this time. And the tests have proven that seeds will absorb the most water at the time of the full moon. And again, I will say for the 6th time, using the days leading up for the best success. So the gravitational pull is high, creating more moisture in the soil, but the moonlight is decreasing. So then we have the energy going back into the roots. So this is when you're going to want to plant root crops, beets, carrots, and perennials, bulbs, and any transplanting because of the active root growth. So this is the waning moon going into the dark moon, leading up to the new again. So in the fourth quarter, there's a decreased gravitational pull and a decreased moonlight. And this is a resting period. It's the same for us. You know, when it's the dark moon, it's like, just take some days off. You don't have to really do any big projects. You know that there's a new moon coming around the bend, and that's a good time to catch that upswing. So, but if you're a gardener, there's still many things to do, such as cultivate, harvest, transplant, fertilize, and prune. So save those for the waning dark moon. And if you're a lawn haver, then you can mow lawns in this period of time to slow down the growth. And this is a good time for, if it's a waning last quarter moon in a water sign, then deep watering of established shrubs and trees, because they're going to be able to uptake the most. And it's like root focused, but with all of that water. So in this era in the West, at least, where we like move in and out of drought conditions, using this sort of thing for how to water your established things or things that you're trying to get established is increasingly important. Okay, so there are different categories of the moon signs when we start to look not just at the phases, at the signs. Some are fruitful, some are barren. So water signs and some of the earth signs are considered to be the most fruitful. And then the barren signs are super valuable for things where we need to destroy things, such as pests, or for harvesting, which isn't destroying exactly, but it's like a reduction kind of activity. So if we start looking, let's just go through all of the moons. So Aries, and this is based on traditional astrology. Aries is a barren sign, and it's useful for the destructive tasks like weeding and plowing. And then we move into Taurus like we did today. This is a fruitful sign, and it's Venus ruled. It's the exaltation of the moon. It's obviously a really good place for plants, food, growing in general. And then it's going to depend on the phase of what you're going to do with it. But baseline with the Taurus moon, you've got something very fertile, very fruitful. Gemini, air sign, barren. It's good for destroying weeds. And then Cancer it's the most fruitful of the sign. It's moon ruled water sign, and then it's Jupiter's exaltation. So like Taurus, these are kind of like the best. And Cancer and Taurus are signs that are really associated with food. So that's obviously a across the board correlation. Then we have Leo. Leo is barren, as it's the sign of the sun, and it's too dry to do much. So you would, do some of the other things like the fire sign moons. We're going to go a little more deeply into this, but this is kind of like the outline. So Virgo is also a barren sign, but it is a good time for weeding and for planting flowering vines and also medicinal plants. So non-fruiting flowering vines. Libra, again, this is ruled by Venus and it's Saturn exaltation. So it's considered, although an air sign, to be moderately fertile. So you would use it for planting flowers, all of which are really happy to be planted under a Libra moon, and then vines. And then Scorpio, water sign, fruitful, happy plants, all the leafy stuff, really love that. Whoops, a little too far. Sagittarius, it's a fire sign, so it's semi-barren, but it's actually considered partially fruitful because it's ruled by Jupiter. So this is what we would use to plant onions and garlic. And then Capricorn is a semi-barren sign. It's an earth sign. It's not super productive, but it's hardy and drought resistant. So again, in this era of drought, then you would factor the Capricorn moons in if you wanted to plant something that you're like, okay, I really hope that this is tough and it's going to last, and then you would wait until a third quarter water moon to water those really well. Aquarius is semi-barren air sign, but it's good for onions. And then Pisces, very fruitful water sign and the traditional domicile of Jupiter. So yes, so a lot of what you already know about the moon signs is going to apply here. So then we're going to look at the elements a little more deeply. So when
we do that, I have a couple of questions here if you've got time for them.
Yeah.
One question is, what is the influence of planets encountered in each phase? Does it change, add, or remove some of the influence of each moon phase?
Yeah, it does. And I'm going to get a little more into the combination.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah. So what you're, the two toggles that you're working with are moon phase and signs. So, you could do it just based on phase and be like, I'm overwhelmed by the signs, or you could just look at the signs, but together, this is like what you want to learn to develop. So, so here, like this, for example, the moon is in the water leaf signs of Cancer, Pisces, and Scorpio. These are the best days for planting everything. Water signs are fertile, but in the first or second quarter, you would want to be planting the above ground bearing leafy annuals. So lettuce, spinach, chives, and brassicas. So we've got the waning moon, and then we've got the water signs. That's the ultimate. So does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. Okay. And I think that, the second question is along that same line. Barren moon, if a barren moon is a few days before a full moon, is it better to wait for a fertile moon? You're going to cover all of that, right? Yeah. All right.
So watering lawns, shrubs, and deeply during the water sign moons, because they're going to absorb more now. So earth signs, so water signs are considered leaf signs, and then the earth signs are considered root signs. So Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, they're fertile, they're good for planting. I mean, we just looked a little more deeply, like Capricorn is sort of fertile, Taurus is super fertile, Virgo is fertile for certain things. But in general, the earth signs are associated with roots. So it's especially good for any underground crops and for transplanting to encourage the root development. So use the third quarter phase of the moon in association with earth signs, in particular for the underground root development. If you know you're planting something that it's like, this is all about the roots, then you will time these two things together, earth signs, third quarter phase, versus where we just were. If you want to be doing something that's an above ground bearing leafy thing, like, all those greens, first or second quarter of the moon with a water sign. So air signs, air are considered the flower signs. So Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius are, in general, air signs are considered barren and dry, but then we know that Libra is an exception because of its rulership of Venus. So it's semi-fertile, and it's good for planting all flowers and herbs, and then vines, tubers, and roots. And again, vines that don't produce fruit. So melons like Gemini moons, and onions respond well in Aquarius. So air signs are a good time to harvest and cultivate the soil, in addition to these targeted things that are good during that particular time. Fire sign, the fire fruit seed signs of Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, they're considered barren and dry. So anytime the moon is in this, you're going to be, planting fruit or planting crops grown specifically for their seed. You can also prune fruit trees during a fire sign, and you can use a Leo moon to weed so that the weed seeds don't sprout. And then you would harvest during a fourth quarter moon with a fire sign for the best preservation and fruit and vegetables for long-term storage. Okay, so now we're going to go through each of the moons and look at what it looks like in each of the different phases. So here's the sign and then the phases. So this is what you guys are wanting. So again, fruit and seed for the Aries moon because it's a fire sign. So barren and dry, and we're going to plant vines, stalks, and fruit trees and seed crops. If an Aries moon happens in the new moon, then you're going to use it to harvest roots and fruits for storage. If the Aries moon happens in the first quarter, waxing moon, then you're going to use it to cultivate, you're going to prune your fruit trees, and you're going to destroy weeds and pests. And then if the Aries moon is the full moon, then you're going to harvest for long-term storage, you're going to cultivate, you're going to prune your fruit trees, you're going to weed, and you're going to control pests. And where is my mouse? There it is. I have a little bar that you guys can't see that I have to move around so I can read everything. And then the last quarter, Aries moon, if you have that waning dark moon with Aries, you're going to, harvest, you're going to cultivate, you're going to prune your fruit trees, you're going to weed and control pests. So, a lot of this is redundant, but I'm going to go through it really thoroughly because I want you guys to see the patterns. I want you to hear it and see the patterns. So Taurus, this is going to be, it's an earth moon, so it's roots, and it's also very productive and moist due to its Venus rulership. So this is the second best moon for planting and transplanting at any time. And the plants that really like this are vines and stalks and fruit trees and seed crops, good for root crops and potatoes. It's also a good sign for transplanting any leafy green vegetables, particularly lettuce and cabbage. So new moon in Taurus, all about above ground annuals. I mean, think about that time, like the Taurus time of the year when the sun is in Taurus is when in the Northern Hemisphere, everything is just, we've gone through the Aries, like intense initiation of spring. And now we're doing all of the like basal leaf growth, like everything's really just like lush and green and full. So you absolutely want to tap that new moon in Taurus for your above ground annual sowing. And then the first quarter, above ground annuals again. And then the full moon, plant and transplant for root growth and hardiness. And I can't see the bottom one. There we go. Nope. I don't know how to make this bottom thing go away. Last quarter, fertilize and prune to limit growth. All right, so Gemini moon, air sign. So that's a flower sign. It's barren and dry, but we may remember that melons and vines are happily love the Gemini moon. So if it's a new moon in Gemini, you're going to cultivate and weed. If it's the first quarter in Gemini, you're going to cultivate and weed and plant melons. And if it is the full moon in Gemini, then you're going to harvest, cultivate, weed, and control pests. And then the last quarter, harvest, cultivate, weed, and control pests. Cancer moon. So here's our ultimate water sign moon for almost everything. Everybody loves it. Very fruitful and moist. I mean, the thing you would want to watch if you are gardening somewhere where it's really wet, like England or something, then maybe it's like, oh, be careful. It's so wet. It's so lush that you would want to, be careful of like mold conditions or something. But here in the West, boy, we sure welcome any Cancer moon type conditions. This is the best time for planting and transplanting any above ground bearing crops, and grafting takes really well, and irrigation, like running the water through your garden and your farm. You want to do that now. New moon in Cancer, above ground annuals, same for the first quarter. The full moon in Cancer, plant and transplant for root growth. I mean, that's going to be happening in Capricorn. So that's something that you would be doing in a greenhouse. But I mean, that's the thing, like you may be, you know, you're not going to be necessarily gardening out in your garden, but there's always something to be doing. If you're really growing food in a big way, even in wintertime, there's going to be things that you're like planning or working on or getting started. So, you know, this really applies all year long. And then the last quarter, Cancer moon, prune, water, compost, and fertilize. Leo moon, fire sign, so fruit sign, very barren and dry, ruled by the sun, really good for seed crops. If it's a new moon in Leo, you're going to cultivate and weed, and you're going to prune. Same for the first quarter. And then the full moon in Leo is cultivation, prune the fruit trees, because that's going to be during the Aquarius sun, and then harvest for long-term storage, get some weeding done, and control the pests. And then the last quarter, dark moon in Leo, an excellent time, extra super good time to destroy weeds and pests. Virgo moon, earth sign, so it's a root sign. It's barren, but it's also moist. And Virgo moons love flowers and vines with blooms, and especially medicinal plants, which correlates with Virgo being, you know, the medicinal healer sign. So the new moon in Virgo, you plant your flowering vines and your medicinal plants. Same for the first quarter. The full moon in Virgo, you're going to harvest, cultivate, weed, control pests, turn your compost, divide and transplant perennial flowers, and you're probably going to organize all of your plant supplies too, I dare say. And then the last quarter in Virgo, harvest, cultivate, weed, and control pests. Libra moon, so flower sign, and it's air, but it's also considered to be semi-fertile and moist. Best sign for planting beautiful and fragrant flowers, so Venusian. So vines and herbs, tubers and roots, all good for the Libra moon, wherever you find it. But in particular, Libra new moon, above ground annuals, flowers and herbs. So that's going to be, that's later in the year. So, you know, around here, we're definitely still starting things. You know, you could still be planting things in the new moon in October. First quarter, plant above ground annuals, especially flowers and herbs. And then full moon in Libra, plant for root growth, plant perennial flowers. It's a great time for transplanting root crops with pulpy stems, such as kohlrabi. I did just plant some of those actually. And then the last quarter, Libra, is prune, water, pick flowers to last the longest. Scorpio moon, it's a water leaf sign, super fruitful and moist. So all plants love it. Tomatoes, squash, corn, vines. It's the best for sturdy plants and vines and really good for transplanting. New moon in Scorpio, you're above ground annuals and pruning for growth. And then the first quarter, Scorpio, same, plant above ground annuals, prune for growth. Full moon in Scorpio, which is during Taurus. So plant and transplant for root growth, hardiness, and prune. And then the last quarter, Scorpio, prune, water, compost, and fertilize, graft or prune to slow down growth and promote better fruit. Sagittarius moon, so it's fire, so it's a fruit seed sign, barren and dry, but remember we have that special condition with Jupiter, so there's a little extra fertility even though it's a fire moon. So potatoes, garlic, onion, root crops, and fruit trees, and a good sign to cultivate the soil. If it's the new moon in Sag, you can plant your fruit trees, cultivate and weed. First quarter, same, plant your fruit trees, cultivate and weed. And then full moon in Sag, which is going to be midsummer, plant your tubers, fruit trees. You know, if you're still planting them, you can plant them then. You can prune the ones that are already planted. You're going to be pruning them for size, which is what happens in the summer pruning. And then harvest and cultivate. And then the dark moon in Sag, harvest for storage, cultivate, weed, and prune those fruit trees. Capricorn moon, earth sign, root sign, productive and dry. So plant your potatoes and any other root crops and anything else that you want to encourage strong, hardy growth. You know, think Capricorn, it's like going to keep on ticking. So onions, shrubs, and seed crops. New moon in Cap, it's a good time to graft and prune to promote healing. You know, if you have a plant that's kind of struggling and you need to take out some diseased material, the barren quality of, relatively barren quality of the Earth Capricorn Moon is good for cutting that stuff out. And cloning, so propagation, applying organic fertilizer, hopefully the only kind that you apply. And then first quarter Capricorn, good for grafting, pruning to promote healing, also cloning, same stuff. A lot of times, you know, you're going to see the new moon and the first quarter are going to be the same. Full moon, plant for root growth, especially potatoes, graft, clone, prune. Last quarter, graft, clone, prune, and fertilize. Aquarius, air flower sign, barren and dry, yet onions love it. So new moon in Aquarius, clone, cultivate, and weed. Same for the first quarter. Full moon, you're going to harvest, you're going to cultivate, you're going to clone, you're going to transplant, and you're going to weed. And then, and the very same for the last quarter, except for the onions. That's pretty much what you're doing during the Aquarius moons. Pisces moon, watery leaf sign, super productive, super moist, second best sign for planting, second to Cancer and transplanting. So literally all plants, and then root crops and potatoes. New moon in Pisces, plant your above ground annuals, fertilize, graft. First quarter Pisces moon, same. Full moon in Pisces, especially good for root growth and transplanting. Last quarter in Pisces, prune, water, compost, and fertilize. There's some beautiful willow leaves. Okay, so combining the phases and the signs. So you're always going to start with the phase, and you're going to, the first question is, where am I? Is it waxing from new to full? Then you know that the moisture content is going to be up. Is it the waning phase? Then the moisture content is going to be down. Then you're going to look at the moon sign. What element is it in? Go back to, you can watch this again and take screenshots of any of this stuff to get the detailed info if you're not getting the notes fast enough. Go back to the elements. In what element do we know the tasks are favored? What sign, what tasks are best performed now? So eventually you're going to have this memorized and you're going to be able to do it effortlessly, but it's worth slowing down and starting from the element, starting from the moon phase and the element every time so that you really get the language. It's like math problems with words involving plants. So you're going to get, this plus this equals this. So after you add in those two, and then you factor in any other seasonal or limiting conditions, you're going to always prioritize the phase and then make your plan. So, take the time, my advice is take the time to look at the gardening year where you are, look, here we are in April, what zone you're in, or you'll figure it out soon. And you'll know when you can actually start to plant out. And if you can't plant out yet, then you can still be starting seeds indoors or in your greenhouse. And so plan around the times that are going to be, this is when you're going to be gardening. This is when you're going to start. There's going to be a huge push. And then look at your whole, just make a map of it. Make a map of the weeks and the weekends ahead of time so that you already have this figured out. And you can get a special calendar. I mean, they sell calendars that have this, but you can also just get your own calendar and write this down. And then you're ready. It's like, oh my gosh, the weekend's coming up and I have the whole weekend that I can garden. What's a good time to do? Or conversely, okay, I know I'm going to start a bunch of seeds this year. I'm taking this really seriously. And so I got corn and I got, brassicas and I got carrots and beets. What is going to be the best time? And then you can make little maps for these seeds. These are, you're looking for the best time. You're simultaneously looking at the times that you're going to be gardening. And then you're looking at what you need to do and figuring out what do these want. So, I can only do so much of this for you because you live in your own place and you have to figure out your own schedule, but I'm giving you, to the best of my ability, all of the pieces that you need to be able to put this together. So yeah, that's a good way to not feel overwhelmed, is to, use the Virgo protocol and make lists and make a plan, make a map. So then you can just plunge in with happiness rather than feeling like, oh wait, what moon sign? It's waxing, it's waning. And then you can grow things like this. So let's just look at the moons of 2022 together. And again, you're going to need to factor in your zones, you know, like if it's, you know, if we're saying April 8th is plant above ground annuals for the first quarter in Cancer, if you're in a zone where like there's still snow on the ground, like you're not going to be doing that outside, but you can be doing this inside. You know, if you are really in love with gardening and you're someplace where the gardening season is kind of limited and you don't have a greenhouse, maybe this is the year that you get a simple greenhouse and you take it to the next level. I mean, you can do quite a bit on your own. I have a friend who takes over her entire workroom, her entire office with plant stands and seedling trays. And I mean, it's very impressive. So you can do it inside. You need to have good lighting. You know, you can do the windowsill thing, but you know, how much windowsill room do you really have? If you really want to do it seriously, it's probably worth investing in a plant stand and with the little heated mats beneath and the lights above. And you know, or a greenhouse and or covered rows. You know, there's lots of different ways to extend the season on either direction. And again, I feel like, you know, where we're at in the world at this point, like gardening's lovely, everybody should garden, but now, I mean, I'm just like, everybody, we need to start gardening. And for the people that can't garden, we need to garden more for them. So that said, let's look at April. So there was a new moon. Well, it's actually yesterday. Or yeah, it was on the 1st. So now I'm feeling confused. Was it on the 1st? Well, whatever, the new moon in Aries, sorry if that's a typo. Then we would be harvesting, cultivating, and weeding. And then the first quarter in Cancer. So note that the 4 phases are here: new moon, quarter, full moon, and last quarter. These are all sorry, I'm noticing a couple of typos. They should all be in the same quality. So cardinal new moon, cardinal first quarter, cardinal Libra, and then that should be Capricorn, last quarter in Capricorn. You'll see this as we go through, they're going to be in the same qualities. So new moon, harvest, cultivate, and weed, because it's a new moon in Aries. First quarter in Cancer, a water sign, a leaf sign, April 8th, plant above ground annuals. And these are the dates, you know, these are the pinpointed dates, but you're, you know, you don't have to like only do it on the 2nd or the 8th. You're working with these times. So we're giving the pinpointed phase, and then we're giving the sign that it's in. And then if you're working a little bit before it or a little bit after it, just know when does the moon change signs? You know, if this is the exact moment that the new moon happens and the first quarter happens and the full moon happens, like you'll, you know, see where the moon changes signs, because your tasks will be different based on when it changes. So first quarter in Cancer on the 8th, plant above ground annuals. Full moon in Libra, so that's air flower. So you're going to be planting for root growth, particularly flowers. Last quarter in Aquarius, April 23rd, harvest, weed, control pests.
We have a question, Paetra.
Okay.
Regarding this. The question is it cultivating, harvesting, and weeding from April 2nd to April the 8th?
Well, that's what I'm saying, that you're going to have to look at the actual when the moon changes signs. You know, like if like we know that this morning, I know that this morning that the moon was in Aries and then it changed to Taurus. So if I'm using this, you know, perfectly, if I got up early and I was doing a bunch of gardening tasks, I would be doing the harvesting, the cultivating, and the weeding up until the moon changed into Taurus. And then at that point, you know, that's a very fertile root moon. So I would shift my tasks. It was too much for the scope of the class to go through every single day of the month for the whole year. So that's what I'm trying to empower you to understand. This is the phase. This is what correlates right here. Here's the moon is in this sign at that time. But if you are looking at, you know, if you have a calendar and you're like, okay, the moon is going to go into Aries and then it's going to go into Taurus, what are the tasks? So does that make sense? You know, it's like I'm handing you enough of the reins that you can figure this out for yourselves, but I can't give you every single like day of what you're going to do. It's going to be based on when the moon changes signs. Does that make sense? Hopefully there's nodding happening.
I think so. Okay. I'll let you know if I see something otherwise.
Yeah. And you guys, if you have questions that aren't getting answered in the course of this, please feel free to email me afterwards, and I'm happy to try and parse this more with you individually about, you know, specific things. Is there another question too? It looks like there's 2 in the queue.
There's a couple of questions if you want to take them now. That one was just particularly related. There was a question sorry, let me go back. Can you give an example of vine plants?
Buying plants?
Yes.
Like, what plants would you buy in the nursery?
Maybe just, what are some examples of a vine plant, like by
Oh,
name?
vine. I thought you said B-U-Y-I-N-G. A vine plant would be like, if you're growing flowers like wisteria or clematis, but a food vine would be like peas or beans. Passion flower, the passion flower that makes food. Foti, that's a medicinal vine. So anything that's, going for it.
Great. And we got a response for the question before this that, yes, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And then there's one more question. How important is the mode, or do you just look at the elements?
It's really just the elements. I think it's just interesting that the modes correlate. It's like in 1 month, there's going to be all of the points of the moon phases are going to be in a mode. So I'm just kind of pointing that out just in terms of like we're observing patterns, but it's really the element.
Okay. And then what if you use Vedic astrology regarding signs? Wax and waning would be the same, but not signs?
Yeah, that is out of my wheelhouse because I'm not practicing Vedic. So that would have to be a question that somebody else could answer.
Okay. Thank you. That's it for
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we did Aries. So May, we have a new moon in Taurus on April 30th. So that is, ultimate time to plant leafy crops, like knock yourselves out. That one is like such a great time to do it. And then the first quarter moon is going to be in Leo. So that's going to be May 8th. So harvest, cultivate, and weed. And again, just to reiterate, whenever the moon changes to Virgo, even though that's the first quarter, as soon as it goes into Virgo, those tasks are going to change. Full moon in Scorpio, mid-May. We're going to be doing above ground annuals, especially tomatoes. And, people that grow tomatoes are really into their tomatoes. So timing the tomatoes with the full moon in Scorpio is important if you really want, the best possible outcome with those. Last quarter in Aquarius, it changes to Pisces on May 22nd. So prune, water, compost, and fertilize up until it changes into Pisces. June, we have a new moon in Gemini at the end of May. That's going to be planting vines. And remember, the Gemini moon loves melons. So, I guess technically a melon is a vine. So squash and melons. And then first quarter moon in Virgo, June 7th. So flowering vines and particularly medicinal plants. And then the full moon will be in Sag on June 14th. So that's when you're going to plant your fruit trees. If you have, a lot of fruit trees are planted bare root, but there is still fruit tree planting that happens year round. So that midsummer moon is a great time to plant some more fruit trees. And then you would use that moon to cultivate and weed. It looks like it says cultivate weed because I didn't put commas in. So you can also cultivate your weed if you're growing cannabis. So last quarter in Pisces, June 20th, that happens on summer solstice. So you'll be planting for root growth. It looks like maybe there's more questions. I'll pause for a second if there are. Maybe they just didn't get cleared from before.
There's a couple of new ones.
Okay.
I think this one you've covered, but I think maybe they would like to hear again about activities for the phases will be done from the start of the phase to the next start of the next phase. So kind of like the question about
Yes. Yeah, like think of it as, this trajectory. It's like, okay, the new moon, it's the increase. So it's going to have that increasing list of tasks. And then from the, that first quarter moon, still increasing, next list of tasks, which often are very similar to the new moon. That whole ascending is pretty similar. Sometimes there's differences. And then we reach that point of the full to the new, the descending tasks are going to be different. So yes, that part is just carrying from one to the next. And then the specific is going to be, what sign is the moon in? So always favoring the phases. If you're feeling, if it's like, what do I do? They kind of conflict, the sign and the phase, default to the phase. That's going to be more important.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about eclipses. One is, do you avoid eclipses? And then the other is specifically about the full moon in Scorpio, I think that's coming up, and asking if we should wait since it's an eclipse.
Yes, eclipses are to be avoided. And yes, unfortunately, we should avoid that one because that's a pretty juicy full moon. But because we're in the Taurus Scorpio nodes, sit that one out.
And then is putting seeds into the soil related to the phases of the moon? Planting is not the same in my vocabulary. This is someone who's asking because they have a different.
Yeah, I haven't been specifying planting versus sowing, but planting seeds and planting plants, I am using those interchangeably for this purpose. So if I'm saying plant, then yes, you could be planting a plant, you could be sowing seeds.
Great, thank you. That's it for.
Okay. Okay, we did June, July. New moon in Cancer, July 28th, super juicy above ground annuals. First quarter in Libra, July 6th, annuals, flowers and herbs. Tap that Venus energy. Full moon in Capricorn on July 13th, graft, clone, prune, and fertilize. And then last quarter in Taurus, July 20th, fertilize and prune. Then new moon in Leo, July 28th, harvest, cultivate, control pests using the barren fire quality. And then the first quarter in Scorpio, August 5th, above ground annuals. Full moon in Aquarius on the 11th of August, you're going to harvest, transplant, weed, and propagate. Last quarter in Taurus, August 18th, you're going to plant and transplant for root growth and especially for potatoes, which feel like a really important crop to be planting in general this year. So yeah, potatoes. September, new moon in Virgo at the end of August on the 27th, flowering vines, medicinal plants, and, you know, emphasis on growing food, but medicinal plants are just as important at this stage of the game. You know, like, thank goodness that there's hospitals and doctors and such, but there's a lot of things that can be treated with medicinal plants tonically, proactively, to the point where we don't get to the chronic stage. You know, like when somebody needs to go to the hospital, it's because they're at it, or they're acute. It's gone from chronic to acute. So using plants, using food as medicine, using medicinal plants in conjunction with food as medicine is the first line of health. That's the very best way to stay healthy and to not ever need to go to the hospital. Like really, you know, blessings to doctors and nurses, but avoid the hospital as much as you can by empowering yourself with your own healthcare. So grow your medicinal plants. And you can use that new moon in Virgo to do that. So first quarter in Sagittarius, September 3rd, you're going to be planting fruit trees if you're in the mood, cultivating and weeding. The full moon in Pisces, September 10th, above ground annuals. And then the last quarter in Gemini, September 17th, use that air dark moon to harvest, cultivate, and weed. October, new moon in Libra, September 25th, above ground annuals, flowers, and herbs. First quarter in Capricorn, October 2nd, graft, clone, prune, and fertilize. And then the full moon in Aries on October 9th, you're going to harvest, cultivate, weed, and control pests. And then last quarter in Cancer, October 17th, plant for root growth and then divide your perennials. November, new moon in Scorpio, October 25th, sow your hardy above ground annuals. First quarter in Aquarius on Halloween, you're going to harvest, cultivate, weed, and clone. Full moon in Taurus, November 8th, plant your hardy annual seeds, sow them, leafy greens also. Last quarter in Leo, November 16th, use that waning fire moon to harvest, cultivate, weed, and control pests. Is there a question?
No, not right now.
Okay. And December, new moon in Sag on November 23rd. Plant your fruit trees. Now you'll be back in the bare root time. Cultivate and weed. And then the first quarter moon in Pisces is still at the end of November. You're going to plant your hardy above ground annuals. This is going to be, you know, in your house or in greenhouses. And then the full moon in Gemini, December 7th, cultivate and weed. And the last quarter in Virgo is December 16th. So harvest, prune, cultivate, especially your medicinal plants. Here's some inspiration.
There was a request if you could show the October slide again quickly.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's the comfrey. Comfrey is a really good plant to grow in general because it's medicinal. It's really good for bones and for any sort of like skin abrasions, but it's also a really good fertilizer. And one of the things that we're about to run into in a big way is damaged supply chains, and also fertilizer shortages, partly originating from the crisis in Ukraine, because a lot of fertilizer comes out of Ukraine and also out of Russia. So learning what sorts of fertilizers can you grow that are, you know, easy, and like comfrey is a little invasive, so you got to be careful where you put it, but it's a really welcome plant if you can give it a corner, kind of an unused corner, and then you can harvest the leaves, put it in your compost. It like potentizes your compost, but you can also make a good fermented tea out of it and water your plants with that. You can also do that with banana peels. That's a really, if you're a banana eater, save your banana peels, just toss them in a bucket, fill it up with water, let it get a little funky, and that's an incredible boost of potassium for your plants. All right, so ideal versus practical. In a perfect world, of course, we would all do nothing but garden and just wait for all the perfect times to arrive. But in the real world, you might just need to get some things in the ground, and you know, you're probably going to need to make compromises here and there, such as a good sign and a bad phase. You know, it's like work, family, travel, inclement weather. You can't necessarily like do this perfectly, and the next perfect window could be a month away, and that's too late. So always just use your instincts and use what you know, and you know, just work with what you have. And if you have to default to the phases. And if you're able to, then work in the signs too. So, you know, to be a true gardener means you are flying by the seat of your pants and you're just winging it a lot of the time. So these are very good guidelines. This is very, very helpful for getting the most out of your gardening experience, which is what we want, because we put a lot in, you know, like gardening is, I mean, it's a labor of love, but there's a lot of labor in it. So how exciting that there are these things that we can do that mean that it's going to go better. You know, it's like, there's nothing quite as exciting as planting something and watching it grow, and then harvesting from it, eating it, making medicine out of it, having it in a vase in your house, you know, giving it as a gift. It's really incredibly rewarding. Chrysanthemum. Talking to plants is one way of directly talking to spirit. This is from herbalist Rosemary Gladstar. She's a Sagittarius. She's one of my early teachers when I started studying herbs. So I want to close by just talking about plant divas working with the invisible realm. So the Davic, or the elemental realm, is something that almost all traditional cultures fully, you know, acknowledge that it exists. They'll talk about the little people, they'll talk about fairies, they'll talk about little globes of light. You know, it shows up in different ways, but this realm does exist. It isn't just woo-woo. And this is the morphogenic field behind the visible world that we see. These are the architectural builders of life on the invisible and etheric level. And they're the ones that hold all the genetic codes. So we can communicate with this plant realm, you know, this Davic realm. If you ever have heard about Findhorn in Scotland, it was this amazing story of this family, just this kind of ordinary middle-class Scottish family that ended up having to go and live in this like northern tip of Scotland, this little like spit of sand surrounded by water on all three sides, like cold northern Scotland. And the woman, Dorothy, I believe her name was, she started communicating with the plant divas. They started communicating with her, and she was like, I don't really know what's happening, but they're telling me to do these things with the plants. And they were a family living there. They were trying to grow food. And her husband, bless his heart, Peter, was like, you know what, I don't hear them, but I fully believe that you do, and I will do whatever it is that they say to do. So the Devas, working with Dorothy, working with Peter, they created this incredible garden that looked like even for like a California garden, it was outrageous, like 40-pound cactuses, like 9-foot lilies, just incredible stuff. And there was no other explanation. Like the fertility wasn't very high. The weather was always inclement. So you have this possibility too. You know, they may not show up and knock on your door, but you can show up and knock on their door, and you can communicate with them in a way, you know, through meditation, through just sitting and letting your garden know, like, I'm available. Like sometimes when I'm in the garden, I'm just like, I'm the hands, you guys tell me what you want. And I don't get the like exact, like I have a plant spirit communicating in my head, but I get these inclinations and pulled to do certain things, so I go with it. So I really encourage you to consider adding this to what you're doing with all of this, because they, you know, they are very affected by everything that's happening on the planet too, and they want things to go better and there to be healing. So if we're working in the context of a relationship with these devas, then your garden also goes better. And they've been at it longer than we have. And, you know, we're all learning how to do this together, like how to increasingly, continually learn to grow really, really beautiful and wonderful gardens. So it's going to be 4 workshops, and they're pinned to what are called the cross quarter days. And if you don't know what those are, in I like to call heirloom magic. It's the way that the year is divided. In addition to the equinoxes and the solstices, there's midpoints between those, and there's a lot of content that relates to the seasons, and in the same way that astrology does. So I'm using each one of the classes with the central point being one of the cross quarter days, and then using the 3 signs, sun in certain signs, in association with them. So we'll be looking at the entire zodiac in relation to the cross quarter days and the seasons through the magical lens.
Awesome. That's awesome. I look forward to those. I'm going to sign up for sure.